This project was made possible by a grant approved by the Americana Corner Preserving America Grant Program. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations do not necessarily represent those of the Americana Corner Preserving America Grant Program. Americana Corner was founded by Tom Hand in 2020 as an online resource to help others rediscover America's incredible founding and first century of expansion. The Americana Corner Grant Program assists organizations to tell the story of our nation's wonderful past and rekindle a love for American history in all its splendor. This video is intended for children in grades 3 through 5. However, it is suggested that adults preview the video in determining suitability for use with children. This video features the perspective of a non-native settler on the Virginia frontier during the time period of the American Revolutionary War. It is not intended to serve as a sole representation of all people of that era, nor is it intended to represent any other perspective from that time. There is mention and portrayal of death, and mention of violence and portrayal of violent action included. Note, no animals were harmed or killed for the purpose of this video. From 1777 to 1779, men were garrisoned at Fort Randolph to defend the western border of the Virginia frontier. However, defending the western Virginia frontier was not an easy task. The fort, originally planned for 130 soldiers, only held about 70 men when at its fullest capacity. By the time it was decommissioned in 1779, only 34 men remained. During the winter of 1777-1778, when General George Washington's troops were at Valley Forge facing severe hardships, the men of Fort Randolph faced similar ones. Diseases such as measles and smallpox were easily spread among the men because they lived and worked in such close living quarters. Of the men who fell ill at Fort Randolph, 13 men died of smallpox during the winter of 1777-1778. Those that did not die sometimes took weeks to recover. This meant there were less able-bodied men to defend the fort. Another hardship faced by the men at Fort Randolph was a lack of supplies. This is because supplies had to be sent either overland or downriver by boats through very dangerous enemy territory. Even when supplies were sent, they were often delayed or stolen by the enemies and never reached Fort Randolph. Conditions became so bad at Fort Randolph that in March of 1778, Fort Randolph's commander, Captain William McKee, wrote a letter to his commander, General Edward Hand, urging General Hand to send food items like pork and flour because Fort Randolph was running out of food. Because of constant shortages like these, the fort had to carefully ration its supplies the entire time it was in use. Another hardship for the men was the constant daily threat of attack by the natives and their British allies. In the fall of 1777, Shawnee Chief Cornstalk had come to Fort Randolph to talk about peace, but he was murdered by an angry mob of militia troops who had just arrived at the fort. Cornstalk's death at the hands of the militia, who were at Fort Randolph, angered the natives so bad that in the spring of 1778, over 200 natives, under the leadership of the Wyandot leader Dunquat, attacked the fort in revenge. Although no men were killed during the siege, the constant threat of attack by the natives and their British allies was an everyday worry, so the men at Fort Randolph had to keep constant watch. Men also faced the hardship of constantly worrying about their families. They knew their families were all alone in the wilderness and would have to fend for themselves. The men knew they would not be there to hunt or plant or harvest the crops their families relied on for food. And the ever-present threat of native attacks meant that their whole family could be lost in just a few moments of time. Yet the men of Fort Randolph faced these hardships bravely.